The wedding of Richard Cole and Isabella Grant was nothing short of extravagant. The hall glittered under grand chandeliers, their golden glow casting light over hundreds of guests dressed in the finest gowns and suits. Richard, tall and commanding in his designer tuxedo, carried himself with the poise of a man who had everything he ever desired. From the business empire he had built brick by brick to the prestige of marrying Isabella, the daughter of a prominent political figure, it seemed his life had come full circle. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and conversations hummed with admiration for the groom's achievements. Yet, beneath Richard's confident smile was a faint unease he couldn't quite name, a whisper in his heart that the perfection of this day might not be as flawless as it appeared. As servers moved about with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, Richard's gaze inadvertently followed one of them. At first, it seemed like nothing, a simple glance at a staff member carrying out her duty. But when his eyes locked on her face, the glass in his hand almost slipped. Evelyn Parker, his ex-wife, the woman he had once vowed to cherish forever, the woman he had abandoned in his blind pursuit of wealth and ambition. Time seemed to freeze. Her presence was like a ghost crashing into the midst of his perfect celebration. She looked different now, her figure fuller, her face tired but graceful, her hands steady despite the obvious weight she carried. And then Richard's heart stopped again. She was pregnant. The sight of her rounded belly beneath the plain black serving dress tore through his composure. A storm of emotions flooded him: guilt, regret, longing, confusion. Richard's mind reeled back to the nights of arguments, the slammed doors, and eventual signature on divorce papers that had severed their bond. He had justified it then, convincing himself that his empire needed all of him, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet here she was, carrying a child, working humbly as a server at his wedding. Questions spun wildly in his head. Was the child his? How had she ended up here, reduced to this life while he thrived? And most of all, why did the sight of her still make his chest ache in a way Isabella never could? As Evelyn turned quickly away, trying to avoid his stare, Richard knew deep within that this night would not end as it was planned. His past had returned, uninvited, and it demanded answers. The ceremony continued with the same perfection Isabella demanded, yet Richard's mind was no longer in the hall. Every time the guests laughed, every time Isabella squeezed his hand with a smug smile, Richard's eyes searched the crowd until they found Evelyn again. She was careful to avoid him, moving from table to table with silent grace, her tray held firmly though her shoulders betrayed exhaustion. For Richard, the world blurred. He remembered Evelyn's laughter when they were young, the way she used to believe in him even when his bank account was empty, the warmth she gave him when the world mocked his dreams. Now she was a stranger in his event, a shadow reminding him that success had come at an unbearable cost. When Isabella leaned in during the dinner toast, whispering how thrilled she was to finally be Mrs. Cole, Richard forced a smile that felt like glass cutting his lips. Isabella's words rang hollow compared to the storm within him. He could not shake the question. Was the child Evelyn carried his? The timing fit. Their divorce had been finalized just months before her disappearance from his life. And though Evelyn had never reached out, perhaps pride or pain silenced her, Richard could not accept that she had carried this burden without him knowing. The unease was unbearable. As the night progressed, Richard excused himself under the pretense of making business calls. Instead, he trailed Evelyn to the service corridor. He stood in the shadows, watching her place empty glasses on a tray, her movements deliberate yet weary. For the first time in years, he noticed how her eyes no longer sparkled, how her smile had vanished. "Evelyn," he finally whispered. She froze. Slowly, she turned, and when their eyes met, it was as if the years of separation collapsed. No words came at first, only the thundering silence of unresolved pain. Then she shook her head, muttering, "Not here. Not now." And with that, she walked away, leaving Richard trembling with the realization that the life he had built might crumble before the night was over. Richard couldn't sleep that night. After the reception ended and Isabella basked in her triumph as a bride, Richard lay awake, haunted by Evelyn's face and the weight she carried. By dawn, his restlessness had grown unbearable. He slipped from the luxurious honeymoon suite and drove across the city. Following the address he bribed one of the catering staff to give him. The neighborhood was nothing like his world of marble floors and imported chandeliers. The paint peeled from old apartments. The streets echoed with early morning vendors shouting their wares, and children played barefoot along dusty pavements. For Richard, It was a cruel reminder of where he had once come from and of the woman he had left behind. When he knocked, Evelyn opened the door cautiously, her eyes widening with shock at his presence. Her modest apartment was clean but sparse, second-hand furniture, faded curtains, and a small crib already assembled near the corner. Evelyn's hand instinctively rested on her belly, protective and cautious. "Why are you here, Richard?" she asked coldly, her voice layered with exhaustion and suspicion. The warmth that once filled her tone when she said his name was gone, replaced by an iciness that pierced his chest. Richard swallowed hard, unable to look away from her stomach. "Is it mine?" he asked bluntly, unable to mask the desperation in his voice. Evelyn's lips trembled, but she looked away, refusing to answer immediately. Instead, Evelyn invited him inside, if only to avoid the gossip of neighbors. "Even if it is yours," she said after a long silence, "what does it matter? You made your choice when you left me for your empire. You don't get to show up now and pretend to care." Richard's face burned with shame, but he stepped closer. "I was a fool, Evelyn. I thought building a name would make me whole. But seeing you again, seeing this, I can't walk away. I won't let you carry this alone." Evelyn's eyes glistened, torn between anger and the buried ache of once loving him. "You don't get to decide that anymore," she whispered. And yet, deep inside, a part of her wondered if she could believe his words. Richard returned to his mansion later that day, his thoughts still consumed by Evelyn. Isabella greeted him with kisses and playful remarks about their honeymoon plans, but Richard could barely meet her eyes. Her beauty, polished and proud, seemed shallow compared to the quiet strength of Evelyn. Guilt gnawed at him, and he struggled to bury his emotions, but Isabella's sharp instinct sensed something was wrong. She pressed him about where he had gone so early, her tone light, but her eyes suspicious. Richard muttered vague excuses, citing urgent business matters, but Isabella was not convinced. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, tore apart by the sudden reappearance of Richard. She hated herself for letting her guard slip when he visited, hated that her heart still reacted to him even after years of abandonment. She had promised herself never to allow him back into her life, but the truth was undeniable. The child she carried was his. She had kept the pregnancy hidden, fearing his rejection and unwilling to beg for his attention. Now fate had forced him back into her world, and she wondered if she could withstand the storm it would bring. That evening, Richard stood in his study, staring at a photograph of himself and Evelyn from their early marriage days. He still remembered how she had worked long nights as a teacher to support them while he built his business from scratch. She had believed in him when no one else did. And how had he repaid her? By abandoning her in pursuit of glory. The shame threatened to crush him. He resolved, for the first time in years, to do something not for wealth, not for appearances, but for love. He would be there for Evelyn and their child. What he didn't know was that Isabella had already decided to uncover the truth behind his distraction, and she would stop at nothing to protect her place in his life. Isabella had always been shrewd. Raised in a home where power was currency, she recognized the smallest changes in people's behavior. Richard's recent attachment was impossible to ignore. While he played the role of the devoted husband in public, his mind was clearly elsewhere. Isabella's pride could not tolerate the idea of competition, especially from a woman of lesser means. Without informing Richard, she discreetly hired a private investigator, a seasoned man named Charles Donovan, known for exposing secrets that others work hard to conceal. Her instructions were clear. Follow Richard, track his movements, and discover the source of his distraction. Charles wasted no time. Within days, he reported back that Richard had been seen entering a modest apartment complex in a less affluent part of the city. He had visited the same location twice, lingering for hours. The name attached to the apartment? Evelyn Parker. The revelation made Isabella's blood run cold. She remembered Evelyn vaguely, Richard's ex-wife who had disappeared from society after their divorce. The thought that Evelyn, of all people, had reemerged at her wedding ignited a fury Isabella had never felt before. She demanded Charles dig deeper, uncovering everything about Evelyn's current life, including the pregnancy. Richard remained oblivious to Isabella's plot. He continued to visit Evelyn secretly, bringing groceries, checking her health, and offering to cover her medical bills. Though Evelyn resisted, his persistence began to soften her anger, if only slightly. But as Richard sat one evening in Evelyn's apartment, gently helping her arrange baby clothes, he felt a pang of fear. His life with Isabella was a fragile glass facade, and with every step closer to Evelyn, he risked shattering it completely. Yet, deep down, he knew he was no longer afraid of breaking it. The moment Isabella confirmed Evelyn's pregnancy, she felt both threatened and betrayed. Richard had not confessed anything, yet his actions spoke louder than words. Isabella confronted him one evening after dinner, her tone deceptively calm as she poured them both a glass of wine. "Who is she?" she asked, her piercing gaze locking on his. Richard froze, the wine glass trembling in his hand. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, but Isabella smirked, sliding photos across the table. Pictures of him entering Evelyn's apartment, carrying bags of groceries, even sitting beside her crib. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella leaned back, her lips curling into a cold smile. "You are still tied to her, aren't you? And now, she's carrying your child. Don't bother denying it." Richard exhaled sharply, realizing the futility of lying. His voice was steady, but his chest burned with conflict. "She's pregnant, Isabella. And yes, it's mine. I can't ignore that." Isabella slammed her hand against the table, her composure cracking. "You will ignore it, or you will lose everything we've built together. Choose, Richard. Me and the life you worked so hard for, or her and that child." Richard's world tilted. Isabella's ultimatum sliced into him like a blade. The empire he had bled to create, the reputation he carried like armor, all threatened to vanish if he chose Evelyn. Yet, when he thought of Evelyn's weary eyes and the unborn child depending on him, he felt a deeper truth rise within him. He could not abandon them again. "I'll make my choice," he whispered, his voice low but firm. Isabella narrowed her eyes, fury simmering as she realized a man she thought she owned might just slip from her grasp. The days that followed were filled with icy silence between Richard and Isabella. She continued to maintain appearances, hosting charity luncheons and attending galas by his side, but behind closed doors, their marriage was unraveling. Richard spent more time away from the mansion, his visits to Evelyn becoming more frequent and openly defiant. The more Isabella tried to guilt him back into submission, the more determined he became to sever the toxic bond between them. Yet, he knew ending this marriage would not be simple. Isabella came from power, and she wielded influence like a weapon. Evelyn, on the other hand, remained cautious despite Richard's renewed devotion. She could see the conflict written on his face, the tug-of-war between his gilded world with Isabella and the fragile future he was trying to build with her. "You can't just come back and expect everything to be forgiven," Evelyn told him one night as they sat together in her small living room. "You left me when I needed you most. How do I know you won't walk away again?" Richard took her hand gently, his eyes brimming with sincerity. "Because this time, Evelyn, I finally understand what truly matters. Not power, not money. You and our child." But even as he spoke those words, Richard knew the battle ahead would test them all. Isabella was not a woman who surrendered easily, and when she realized Richard was slipping away entirely, she would unleash every ounce of her influence to destroy the bond between him and Evelyn. Richard's decision to stand by Evelyn was no longer just a matter of love. It was a declaration of war against the very empire he had built. News travels fast in elite circles, and Isabella made sure of it. At a high-profile gala hosted by one of her father's political allies, she strategically dropped a bombshell to selected guests, whispers that Richard was rekindling ties with his ex-wife, who was pregnant. The story spread like wildfire, amplified by gossip blogs and social media influencers who thrived on scandal. By the next morning, Richard's face graced tabloids across the city, headlines screaming of betrayal and double lives. His empire began to tremble as investors demanded explanations. Richard, though furious, refused to back down. In a press statement, he did not deny the rumors. Instead, he admitted that Evelyn Parker was indeed Carrie's child and that he intended to be part of their lives. The confession shocked his business associates, outraged Isabella's family, and threw society into a frenzy. Isabella herself was humiliated. Her carefully crafted image as the perfect wife crumbled overnight, and the whispers she had once controlled now turned against her. The betrayal she had intended to expose Richard would had only made him more resolute in his choice. Meanwhile, Evelyn was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Paparazzi crowded her building, journalists dug into her past, and her quiet life was ripped open for public consumption. Though terrified, she found strength in Richard's unwavering stance. For the first time since their divorce, she saw the man she had once fallen in love with, the man willing to fight for her. And as the scandal deepened, So too did their fragile bond, tested by flames yet slowly forged into something stronger. The inevitable came one stormy afternoon. Richard returned to mansion to find Isabella seated in the grand living room, divorce papers spread across the glass coffee table. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes filled with both fury and wounded pride. "You've made your choice," she said coldly. "So let's end this farce before you humiliate me any further." Richard stood there, silent for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. I have made my choice." With deliberate movements, he picked up a pen and signed the papers, his signature sealing the end of their tumultuous union. Isabella's composure cracked only briefly, her eyes glistening before she quickly hardened her gaze. "You'll regret this, Richard. You've thrown away power, respect, and everything we built. For her. For a woman who couldn't keep up with you the first time." Richard met her stare with steady calm. "Maybe I'll regret it in the boardroom, but in my heart, this is the only decision I'll never regret." His words cut deeper than any blade, and Isabella turned away, too proud to let him see the pain behind her mask. By the end of the week, the divorce made headlines. Isabella withdrew to her father's estate, plotting quietly, while Richard moved into Evelyn's neighborhood temporarily, determined to prove his dedication not with wealth but with presence. For Evelyn, the sight of Richard showing up daily, whether to fix a leaky faucet or accompany her to doctor's appointments, began to chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. Yet, even as hope flickered, she remained cautious. Trust, once broken, was not easily mended. Life shifted in unexpected ways. Richard adjusted quickly to Evelyn's modest world, trading his mansion for her two-bedroom apartment filled with the scent of baby powder and the soft hum of lullabies she played at night. For the first time in years, he found joy in the simplicity of life. Cooking dinner together, walking hand in hand through local markets, and feeling the baby kick when he gently placed his palm on Evelyn's stomach. These moments grounded him, stripping away the layers of ambition that had once blinded him to what truly mattered. Evelyn, though touched by his sincerity, remained guarded. She remembered the years of loneliness when he had chosen boardrooms over their marriage, and the humiliation of being left behind while he soared to wealth. "You're here now," she admitted one evening. "But what happens when the shine wears off? When life gets difficult, will you stay?" Richard didn't hesitate. "I'll stay through every storm. I lost you once because I couldn't see what mattered. I won't make that mistake again." His eyes held a conviction she hadn't seen before, and for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe he might mean it. But just as they began to find rhythm, the outside world refused to let them breathe. Investors withdrew from Richard's projects, accusing him of recklessness. Social elites whispered about his fall from grace. And though Evelyn wanted to shield their unborn child from the chaos, she realized their journey was only beginning. Love alone would not be enough. They would have to withstand the weight of the world if they truly wanted redemption, and Evelyn wondered if Richard was ready to pay that price. Richard's decision to leave Isabella and stand with Evelyn came at a cost heavier than he anticipated. Several board members resigned from his company, citing concerns over unstable personal choices. Newspapers painted him as a reckless man who had traded success for sentiment, and competitors pounced on every opportunity to chip away at his empire. Richard felt the sting of loss when deals he had spent years nurturing collapsed overnight. But each evening he returned home to Evelyn, he realized the price was worth paying. Evelyn's pregnancy was entering its final trimester, and every time he placed his ear against her belly, hearing the faint rhythm of their child's heartbeat, his resolve strengthened. Evelyn, however, could see the weight pressing down on him. She appreciated the groceries he bought, the repairs he made around the apartment, and the gentle way he rubbed her back when she was tired. But she also saw the exhaustion in his eyes when he returned from another failed business meeting. "I didn't ask you to sacrifice everything for me," she told him one night, her voice trembling. Richard shook his head firmly. "This isn't about sacrifice, Evelyn. This is about doing what I should have done years ago. Choosing us, choosing family. Money can come and go, but you and this child, you're irreplaceable." Despite his words, Evelyn's fear lingered. She had once believed in him with all her heart, only to watch him leave when ambition clouded his judgment. What assurance did she have that history wouldn't repeat itself? Richard's dedication felt real, but scars of betrayal were not so easily erased. As she drifted to sleep, her hand resting on her swollen belly, Evelyn prayed silently that Richard's newfound conviction would endure the storms ahead. By now, The story of Richard and Evelyn had grown into a national scandal. Bloggers churned out stories portraying Evelyn as a manipulator who had trapped a wealthy man with pregnancy, while others romanticized the narrative of lost love rekindled. Richard tried to shield Evelyn from the noise, but it was impossible to ignore the constant paparazzi outside her building or the reporters who chased her on her way to prenatal checkups. The spotlight was suffocating, and Evelyn began to question if her simple life would ever return to normal. Isabella, nursing her wounded pride, fueled the flames further. Through her family's influence, she ensured news outlets painted Evelyn as a woman of low morals. Anonymous tips appeared in tabloids claiming Evelyn had other lovers during her marriage to Richard, insinuating the baby might not even be his. The gossip was venomous, and though Richard publicly dismissed the lies, Evelyn felt the sting deeply. She withdrew into herself, speaking less, her laughter fading. Richard noticed a shift and worried constantly, knowing that the stress could harm both Evelyn and the child. One evening, Richard came home to find Evelyn in tears, her phone buzzing with hateful messages from strangers. He took the phone, smashed it against the wall, and pulled her into his arms. "Let them talk," he whispered fiercely. "The world doesn't define us. What matters is what we know, what we build. And I swear to you, Evelyn, I'll fight every battle that comes our way. You won't stand alone ever again." Evelyn wanted to believe him, and though doubt lingered, the strength in his embrace gave her the smallest flicker of hope. As Evelyn's due date approached, her body grew more fragile. One rainy afternoon, Richard found her collapsed on the living room floor, clutching her stomach in pain. Panic surged through him as he rushed her to the hospital, his mind filled with worst-case scenarios. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. Sitting in the stark white waiting room, he realized just how much he had come to depend on Evelyn's presence. The thought of losing her or the baby left him trembling, his hands clasped tightly as he prayed for the first time in years. When the doctor finally emerged, Richard felt his breath catch. "She and the baby are stable," the doctor assured him. "But she must avoid stress and overexertion. Her blood pressure is elevated, and the pregnancy is delicate. You must make sure she rests." Relief washed over Richard, but guilt soon followed. He blamed himself for the stress Evelyn endured, the scandal, the gossip, the upheaval he had brought into her life. He vowed silently to do better, to protect her more fiercely than ever before. Visiting her in the hospital room, Richard sat by Evelyn's side, gently holding her hand. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. "I thought I was going to lose her," he whispered, his voice breaking. Evelyn gave him a tired smile. "We're still here, Richard, but please, don't promise me the world. Just promise me you'll stay." Richard leaned forward, his forehead pressed against hers. "I'll stay, Evelyn. I'll stay no matter what it costs." And for the first time, Evelyn believed him completely. The day Grace was born was both terrifying and miraculous. Evelyn had gone into labor suddenly, her cries waking Richard in the middle of the night. He rushed her to hospital, his heart pounding as the doctors wheeled her into the delivery room. Hours passed, filled with the sound of Evelyn's pain and Richard's desperate prayers whispered under his breath. Finally, as dawn broke, a nurse emerged carrying a tiny bundle. "Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You have a daughter." Richard's hands trembled as he took the baby for the first time. Grace's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, her skin soft and warm, her cries filling the room with life. Tears blurred his vision as he looked down at her. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking with awe. Evelyn, exhausted but glowing, reached for their child. As Richard placed Grace gently into her arms, Evelyn's eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen in years. For the first time since their marriage ended, they shared a moment of unspoken unity. The child between them was a bridge to healing. When Isabella heard of Grace's birth through press, her fury reignited. The sight of Richard proudly announcing his daughter to the world cut her deeply. She realized then that her hold on him was gone forever. Yet instead of retreating, she swore vengeance. If Richard thought he could humiliate her so publicly and escape unscathed, he was gravely mistaken. In the shadows, she began weaving plans to strike back at both Richard and Evelyn, determined to make them pay for her disgrace. Life with a newborn was both exhausting and transformative. Richard found himself waking in the middle of the night to feed Grace, learning to change diapers, and rocking her to sleep while Evelyn rested. These small, intimate acts filled him with a joy he had never known. For years, he had measured his worth by profits and acquisitions, but now he found meaning in Grace's smile, in Evelyn's quiet gratitude, in the laughter that slowly began to return to their small home. Still, rebuilding trust was not easy. Evelyn remained cautious, her heart still scarred by his past betrayal. She watched him closely, testing his consistency. When business associates came knocking, urging him to repair his empire and return to the spotlight, Richard refused without hesitation. "My place is here," he told them firmly, holding Grace in his arms. Evelyn noticed, and each refusal chipped away at her doubt. Though fear lingered, she could no longer deny that Richard was proving himself not with words, but with actions. One evening, as they sat together after putting Grace to bed, Evelyn finally spoke the words that had been lodged in her chest for months. "Maybe we do have a second chance," she whispered, her eyes glistening. Richard reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Not maybe, Evelyn. We do. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you." For the first time in years, Evelyn leaned into him without fear, and Richard knew this fragile beginning was blossoming into something real. Though their home was filled with new life, danger loomed just beyond their walls. Isabella resurfaced with legal threats, claiming defamation over Richard's public statements, and even attempting to question his rights as Grace's father. She leveraged her family's wealth and influence to drag Richard into court, determined to tarnish his reputation further. The case quickly became a media spectacle, with journalists crowding the courthouse steps. Evelyn dreaded the attention, fearing the stress would harm their fragile peace. Richard, however, faced Isabella head-on. In court, he calmly defended his actions, stating that his choice to be with Evelyn and Grace was not an act of betrayal, but one of responsibility. He spoke of abandoning Evelyn once and refusing to do so again, his words resonating with both the judge and the public. Isabella's attempt to paint Evelyn as manipulative fell flat, as witnesses testified to her quiet resilience and honesty. Slowly, public opinion shifted, and Isabella's grip weakened. After weeks of grueling hearings, the court dismissed Isabella's claims. Furious and humiliated once more, she stormed out of the courtroom, her threats echoing in Richard's ears. But Richard no longer feared her. He returned home to Evelyn and Grace, vowing that nothing and no one would tear them apart again. Still, deep inside, he knew Isabella's bitterness had not ended. She would find another way to strike, but this time he was prepared. Months passed, and Richard continued to dedicate himself to fatherhood and rebuilding his relationship with Evelyn. One evening, after a simple dinner at home, he surprised her by pulling out a small velvet box. Evelyn gasped as he knelt before her, Grace babbling happily in her crib nearby. "I failed you once," Richard began, his voice steady but emotional. "I broke the vows I made to you because I was blinded by ambition. But now, Evelyn, I understand what it means to truly love, to truly commit. Will you marry me again, not in grandeur or wealth, but in truth and redemption?" Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she looked down at him. She remembered the first time he had proposed, full of dreams but also arrogance. This moment was different. Richard was not offering her castles or promises of riches. He was offering sincerity, humility, and a heart that had been remade by their trials. "Yes," she whispered softly, her voice trembling. "Yes, Richard, I'll marry you again." The joy on his face was indescribable as he slipped the ring onto her finger. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that their love could truly be reborn. That night, as Grace slept soundly, Richard and Evelyn held each other tightly. They both knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But for the first time in years, they were not walking it alone. They had chosen each other again, and this time they would protect their love with everything they had. Unlike the grandeur of Richard's wedding with Isabella, his remarriage to Evelyn was intimate and simple. They chose a small church in the city, inviting only close friends and family. Evelyn wore a modest white gown, her hair adorned with fresh flowers, while Richard stood tall in a plain suit, holding Grace in his arms. The vows they exchanged were not polished speeches, but heartfelt promises born of pain, forgiveness, and newfound understanding. When Richard spoke, his voice trembled. "Evelyn, I vow never to abandon you again, never to place ambition above love, never to break the trust we are rebuilding. You are my heart, and Grace is our future. Together, we are whole." Evelyn's eyes glistened as she replied, "Richard, I vow to believe in you again, to walk beside you in both storms and sunshine, to raise our daughter with love and faith. This time, Our vows would not be broken. The congregation erupted in applause as they sealed their vows with a kiss. Grace gurgled happily in Evelyn's arms, her tiny hands reaching out as if blessing their union. It was not wealth or power that defined the day. It was love, fragile yet resilient, that had conquered all for Richard and Evelyn. The simple ceremony was more meaningful than any lavish wedding could ever be. Married life the second time around was different. Richard no longer chased endless board meetings or prestige. Instead, he dedicated himself to rebuilding his business ethically at a slower pace, with Evelyn and Grace always at the center. Evelyn returned to teaching part-time, her passion for nurturing young minds reignited. Their home, though modest, was filled with laughter, warmth, and the steady rhythm of love that neither of them had known during their first marriage. Isabella's shadow lingered, but Richard and Evelyn chose not to let bitterness define them. They focused on raising Grace in an environment free from resentment, teaching her the values of honesty, kindness, and resilience. Every milestone Grace reached, the first word, the first step, was a celebration that drew Richard and Evelyn closer. Each night, as they tucked her into bed, they whispered prayers of gratitude for the second chance they had been given. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined their future. Richard and Evelyn had learned the hard way that love was not about perfection, but perseverance. Their story was not one of flawless romance, but of broken pieces made whole again, and that, more than anything, made their love unshakable. Years later, Richard stood in the backyard of their modest home, watching Grace play with neighborhood children. Her laughter echoed through the air, pure and joyful, a sound that reminded him daily of the life he had almost lost. Evelyn walked out carrying lemonade, her eyes still carrying the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her years ago. Richard wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We did it," he whispered. "We found our way back." Evelyn smiled, resting her head against his chest. "We didn't just find our way back. We built something stronger than before." Their journey had been filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and trials that tested every ounce of their strength. But in the end, they had chosen forgiveness, redemption, and love. The vows they had spoken years earlier in grandeur had been broken, but the vows they now lived daily, through sacrifice, devotion, and unwavering presence, were stronger than any ceremony. As the sun set, Richard knelt once again, not with a ring but with gratitude. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said softly, "for giving me another chance, for giving us Grace, for teaching me what love truly means." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and she kissed him tenderly. Together, they watched their daughter dance in the golden light, the symbol of their redemption. Their story was proof that broken vows could be mended, that forgiveness could heal, and that love, when chosen again and again, was the greatest vow of all. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.